Doug Bandow is a senior fellow at the CATO Institute, former special assistant to President Reagan, and author of Foreign Follies, America's New Global Empire. He has a recent piece over at the American Conservative, AmericanConservative.com, about the foreign policy debates that we're not really having, although there's some people that are pushing the parameters out a bit when it comes to discussions about America's military might and how it should be used. Rand Paul comes to mind, J.D. Vance to some extent, certainly widening the parameters. We had that interview with Bret Baier that Ron DeSantis did last night, where he was asked some of the customary foreign policy questions of the day: Russia, Ukraine, China, Taiwan, and basically took the establishmentarian position, I would say. I mean, he is not a, neocon banging the drums of war, deter China from attacking Taiwan, invading Taiwan through America's strength, economically and otherwise, and support the Ukrainians in their fight to repel the Russians without deploying troops, without interfering and trying to broker an armistice. Let's see what Doug Bandow thinks about those positions, which I'm sure he's very familiar with. Doug, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Sure, happy to be on.
So, you want a debate that's more expansive than I'll end that war in 24 hours and the establishment position that I was just describing DeSantis taking?
Yeah, I think that, the issues we're facing are incredibly serious. What do you do with China? Are you actually prepared for a major conventional war with a country with nuclear weapons? We seem to be sleepwalking into a confrontation in East Asia. I believe in supporting Ukraine, but the question is, where does this go? And the critical issue for the United States, frankly, is to get the war over. We don't want to end up with a confrontation with Russia. We see within the U.S. political system, it is very hard to find anyone suggesting anything less than kind of the current policy, the think tanks, the media, et cetera. These are fairly dangerous issues, and we need more of a kind of a willingness of the system to consider alternative opinions. And frankly, you could run it back to the Iraq War, where at some point it became very hard to resist pressure to go to war with Iraq, which today most policymakers would admit was a mistake and went very badly. But at the time, people who predicted that, found themselves under very sharp attack, very hard to make their case.
Well, right, and also, too, even to the extent that you wanted to go into, say, Afghanistan and issue a reckoning to those that were responsible, starting with bin Laden, those that were believing he was in Afghanistan or Pakistan as well. You want to issue a reckoning to those responsible parties with respect to 9/11. You still had the additional step that was taken of nation building that had us sort of bogged down in Afghanistan for 2 decades, dealing with dubious characters like Hamid Karzai, believing they're going to be sort of modern-day George Washingtons, and it seems to be playing itself out again in Ukraine to some extent.
No, that's right. And I think Afghanistan is a great example. I mean, I visited there twice. And there's no doubt we had to go in initially, into my mind, in terms of the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. But the idea of being there 20 years later, trying to bring democracy to Central Asia, especially through governments like Hamid Karzai, and Ghani, the final guy who fled and kind of led to the collapse of everything, I think showed the problem, how these issues kind of take on a life of their own, and then it's very hard to try to stop it.
So, how should we have left Afghanistan? I mean, it was such a deadly withdrawal. What could Biden have done differently?
Well, I think, frankly, we should have been out of there sooner. I mean, I think that the problem with Biden, in fact, much of the issue, I think, was not so much Biden, but kind of the overall military establishment that didn't want to leave, and they had successfully avoided the pressure from President Trump. He had wanted to get out, and they had resisted that very strongly, and he hadn't. And it wouldn't surprise me if they thought that they could convince Joe Biden as well to back away. The problem was there wasn't nearly enough planning for getting out. One of the problems preceded the president, which was we should have been getting interpreters and all the people who've been supporting us out over the years.
Yeah.
We had lots of people thousands of them who wanted to get out. The process never worked. We got virtually nobody out. If we'd been bringing them out regularly, we wouldn't have panicked anybody. It wouldn't have looked like, oh my goodness, everybody better run for the exits. But they would have been gone before we got to the end game. And when we needed to have, recognize, I went to, Kabul, and I went out through both of the military and the civilian airports. They're in the center of the city. The moment everything started falling apart, everybody's going to rush for those airports. It's going to be utter chaos. And the system clearly, when the cities that started falling, many of them were not in Taliban areas. Essentially the Taliban were just buying off local elites. Everybody decided this is going under. So I think the thing we needed to have had a more structured and effective withdrawal, and I think that needed better planning. And my sense is that there was resistance within the administration where finally the president said, I want to do this, and then everything fell apart very quickly.
Well, and again, with respect to that, I completely agree. The translators, the allies on the ground in Afghanistan, the Afghan people that worked with our military, to not keep our promises, that also reverberates around the globe. It's an embarrassment. It's a black mark. And this is not, and it's sort of like talking about big city police forces. It's not an indictment of the rank and file cops, just like a non-indictment of the rank and file soldiers on the ground. It's an indictment of the leadership of these institutions. And, it seems to me that the leadership, the generals, coming under more scrutiny as another example of an expert class that doesn't seem to exhibit much expertise.
Absolutely. The people to talk to are captains and majors who were kind of leading the fighting men. I've talked to some, and the stories they tell of being out in isolated outposts and what they saw, the corruption they saw, et cetera, which basically the higher up said, don't worry about that. That's not our charge. And of course, the problem is that undermines, support, especially of rural Afghans, where the fighting is all around them. Afghans are dying. The U.S. is in league with local corrupt warlords. This is something which a lot of our service people saw, but we're told, just shut up about it. You can't do anything about it. And I think that's one of the problems. And when people say support the troops, we should, but the people to blame with these failures are not the rank and file. They're not the people who are on the front lines. It's a question of a very political leadership who came back to Washington and frankly didn't tell the truth in terms of what's going on, what's the future look like. Washington Post did a very powerful series looking at, it's called the Afghanistan Papers, and basically, the misstatements and the claims that were made over the years, they were just shocking. And which and our political leadership did not act on that, and ultimately they are the ones in authority and to blame.
Well, and we have the Zelensky papers, if you will, or the Ukrainian papers, if you will, too. That national Air National Guardsman who I guess leaked classified documents. The guy in Massachusetts, and what that same military brass was saying publicly about Ukraine and the war effort there, as to what they privately felt. Those were two different things. They were telling the public something very different than they believed, and we're talking about behind closed doors.
That's right, and that seems to have played a role in terms of the current counteroffensive, which does not appear to be going very far, with what would appear to be very significant Ukrainian casualties. Now, of course, one of the problems here is it's very hard to get good information in terms of what's going on. But if we're in a situation where the Ukrainian government is working through all of the weapons it was given, and it's eating up its manpower reserves and losing lots of trained soldiers, the question is, well, what is the future for the Ukrainian war effort? And we kind of promote this as they've got to win. We believe they're going to win. But I think the real question is, if you went to the Pentagon today, how many of them actually believe that? If you don't believe that, then you need to start thinking about things like negotiations, because you don't want to get in a position where it looks like Ukraine could collapse. And we're kind of left out in the dark. It's a money pit. We pour lots of cash in, but we're not getting much evidence in terms of how much is that helping.
We also do this. All the rhetoric is that this is open-ended for as long as it takes, and I understand that sending a message to Putin that we're not going anywhere. This will be sustained, and our support will be sustained, and that's the message you want to send. And I'm not saying that we send diplomats over and tell Zelensky you have to give up this piece of land and this piece of land. but I mean, we do have an interest there based on the support we were given. So the idea that we don't have any say, we're just Pontius Pilate after we drop ship all the weapons. Well, that doesn't seem to make sense to me. It seems like you want lines of communication, not just what do you need, but listen, at some point you need to have some contingency plans about how this ends. What victory looks like, or what what a outcome that you can tolerate looks like. And I don't know if those conversations are happening.
Well, the point that I make is that American officials, the topmost priority for them is America's interest. That is, and it's not the same as Ukraine's. So we have an interest in supporting Ukraine, but Ukraine has its own set of interests. I mean, they want Crimea back. I don't blame them.
Right.
But I don't believe the U.S. has any particular interest in promoting a war that could go nuclear or something in terms of trying to get Crimea back. So what we need to do, I think, is be realistic in our expectations and what we're willing to support, and make that point to the Ukrainians. That is, they can choose anything they want, but there are limits to our support, and what we need to do is tell them what that is, and then let them make the decision. So I'm not going to tell them what their peace desire should be.
Right.
But they need to know how far we are willing to go, and there's a limit. And it's the same thing with NATO. They want to be in NATO. I understand that. But we don't want to go to war for them, which means we can't bring them into NATO. We shouldn't feel embarrassed by that. The point is, American officials are supposed to be most concerned about defending our people, and there's good reason to ensure we don't get in a shooting war with Russia.
He is Doug Bandow, senior fellow at the Cato Institute, former special assistant to President Reagan, and author of Foreign Follies, America's New Global Empire. Doug, thanks as always. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. Take care now.
Thank you. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
Listen to podcasts of Dan and Amy from the AM 560 mobile app. Download it today at 560theanswer.com/mobile.
This is Hugh Hewitt for townhall.com. U.S. District Court Judge Norika was right to blow the whistle on this plea deal proposed for Hunter Biden by U.S. Attorney David Weiss. On rare occasions, a federal judge charged with reviewing plea agreement will reject the terms of that agreement. In a number of such cases, the disparity between the guidelines for sentencing and the agreed punishment is so great that it catalyzes the judge's review. The terms must pass this judicial sniff test. Hunter Biden's plea deal over tax and gun charges was ripe for rejection. Simply put, that deal stunk. What we've learned from the hearing raises a host of additional questions. Bargaining away even token jail time on the tax charges goes beyond lenience into outright unfairness, as does putting the gun charge out of the judge's review if she accepts the proposal. Signing off on this deal would have undercut the very premise of equal justice that sentencing guidelines were created to safeguard. I'm hoping Judge Norika presses back hard as the hearing continues.
It's hot and humid outside, but your basement or crawl space shouldn't feel that way. High humidity above 60% will